Okay. Um, let us now begin a new chapter and a new lesson. And this first section we're going to do in chapter 12, lesson 1 is going to be long, and the next two are going to be short. So let's get through the long one first. And really, this whole chapter is going to be about evaluating the economy. And the first and most important way that economists oftentimes evaluate the economy of different countries is through a measure called GDP. GDP is the measure of all the goods and structures produced and all services provided in a country. I oftentimes have described it as everything bought, sold, and made in a country. We're going to find out that's not 100% true. Bear with me. Here is a map of global GDP. And you can see the United States is one of the richest countries in the world. This is the darkest of colors. You can put GDP next to China, next to some European countries as the world leaders. Okay. And we then oftentimes measure GDP growth as a way to see how well your country's doing. We, in the United States, believe that if you can get above 3% GDP growth, that your economy is doing very well. That between 2 and 3% is probably average, that below 2%, 1 to 2% is below average. And that if you, of course, fall in the negative numbers, that's how you measure a recession. 2 straight quarters of negative GDP growth is a recession. And we do often look at GDP growth in terms of quarters, quarter of the year. And we'll say like January through March, April through June, July through September, October through December. Each quarter is a defined period. So you can't be like, oh yeah, we had negative growth, February through April. No, that's not a defined quarter. In fact, I'm going to show you guys some stats here of our most recent GDP quarterly growth. We see here, this is the Great Recession. It begins at the end of Bush's last year. Obama takes over and he fixes it. He gets us to where we only have 2 negative quarters in the majority of his 8 years. And he even had some quarters that were as high as 4.5, or that 5% growth. I mean, these are big, big quarters here, right next to smaller quarters. Here's President Trump. He doesn't ever have a quarter above 4. And of course, this is the first quarter, mind you, of the coronavirus. Now, we don't blame Trump for this. This is the coronavirus. This is an emergency. We know what we've been through and what thankfully we're getting out of. Just as we don't blame Obama for this. Right? This was the Great Recession, and it didn't happen during his time. It happened before, and he dealt with the results. Was this Bush's fault? Probably in part, but we keep it 100 here, and I'm going to say this was also probably in part Clinton's fault, probably in part Bush the First's fault, and probably in part Reagan's fault. So this is very, we don't totally blame Bush the Second on the Great Recession on Bush the Second, although he does hold some blame. Now let's take a closer look at the last few years. Really, this is Trump's presidency, because I wanted to show this. This shows the pickup after. You saw this little downturn here under Bush. This is a negative 5% GDP growth in the very beginning of the Great Recession. But look at this. Oh my gosh, this is historic. This is Great Depression level, negative 30+% GDP growth in that second quarter of 2020 when the economy was shut down. But look, boom, historic rebound, plus 30%. GDP growth. So negative GDP, positive GDP, and then it's been growing better than at any other point of his presidency, at least in that end of the quarter. And then here, this is Biden. His first bit is better than even that. But that happens. Okay, that's normal when there's a huge drop, especially if it's an unnatural drop like the coronavirus. You're going to have a big rebound, right? This was unique. This wasn't even like the Great Recession. The Great Recession was a structural problem that had been built up for 30 years and didn't have the kind of quick rebound. This was like we're shutting everything down, we're opening everything back up, like turn it off, on and off, the light switch. So I just wanted to show you this last year. I thought it was interesting for you to see, and including even the beginning of Biden's presidency, which oftentimes we say that the first quarter of a new president's term is equal parts him and the president before. So we want to give Trump his credit there as well. And all presidents, this is true for all presidents. So, the first part of Obama's quarter, right? That's Bush's presidency too. And the first part of Trump's presidency here, probably Obama's presidency. This is just it's how we look at things as economists. Now, we're going to take a look at this actually, let me get to the next bit. This is connected to this. So another term that we use is called real GDP. It's GDP adjusted for inflation. So if the GDP is 2%, but inflation is 2%, that's a break-even proposition, right? The economy is growing at 2%, but the dollar is weakening at 2%, and that's a zero. So that's how they come up with real GDP. Is you take GDP and you subtract the inflation rate, and you can get a more realistic view of how the economy is doing. This here is all the way back to the Great Depression. There's 100+ years of real GDP growth. And of course, you see that before the Great Depression there was this is purely inflation. Before the Great Depression, before the Franklin Roosevelt economic policies that he put in place, we were boom and bust, right? This isn't even Great Depression. This is the 1910s. And you see huge inflation, huge deflation, huge inflation, huge deflation. That was how the economy used to work before Franklin Roosevelt came in and he tried to mellow things out. Also, the effect of the wars. This is World War II, this is World War I, that plays a part. And as we go along, we see that, in the Eisenhower years, it was pretty stable. In the Kennedy years, Johnson years, pretty stable. But in the 70s, we saw an enormous spike of inflation. In part, that was gas prices. This was the OPEC oil crisis, the Middle Eastern oil-producing countries where the large majority of the world's oil came from back then. First, they stopped selling oil to the United States in large part because of the U.S. support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And then after that, they raised the prices dramatically in oil. That causes huge inflation. Oil is a big thing. Everyone, you use it for your car, and if the price of oil doubled overnight, it would cause everything to go up. Not just my gas bill, but the gas bill to bring all the stuff to the store, and all the planes, which means all that stuff is going to cost more too. The 70s, there was massive inflation. In the beginning 80s, there was huge inflation, and then inflation will come down, and we've seen relatively weak inflation over the last few decades, which I've even mentioned in the past that some economists suggest that if we're not getting between 1% and 2% inflation, that it actually hurts us, because there's this idea baked into the national debt that inflation is going to make the national debt smaller over time. Okay, but anyways, this is how you look at real GDP growth. You take your GDP minus your inflation. And then we have GDP per capita. This is a chart of GDP per capita. You take the GDP, you divide it by the population, and you find out on average how much money people make in your country. And you can see USA has a high GDP per capita compared to other rich countries, European countries, and then China and India. And that's maybe a better way to look at the average citizen's economic situation is GDP per capita, better than just straight GDP. Although the great part about looking at straight GDP is it shows the tax base of a country, which can oftentimes be used to predict its military power. Because the more money you're getting in taxes, the more money you have for the military. So all of these factors need to be taken into consideration when we have these conversations about GDP. Give me a second. Okay, now I'm going to go to some websites. Thank you, Country Economy, for letting me use this. This is educational. I'm not monetizing it. Yes, this is GDP per year. It's really hard to find this because I told this earlier. It's easier to find per quarter, but look. Look at the GDP growth per year in numbers, and this list goes pretty far back, okay? Gosh, let's just keep looking. How far back are you gonna go for us? Really far. World War II era, okay. And what we find, and we're gonna now focus back in on our more modern era, is that, well, last year, thanks in a large part to coronavirus, we had negative GDP growth for the first time in 12 years, for the first time since the Great Recession. During the Trump years, he's able to get in the twos, in this year a 3, which is good. That, right, we said 2s is fine, 3 is good. During the Obama years, he also is most of the time in the 2s, although he has 1 year with 3.1. That's a good year, a bunch of average years. Some of these ones may be a little bit lower than you'd like. But here's the Great Recession, right? These are mostly connected to the Bush years, but also, economic policy of Bush the first. And Reagan contributed. Bush actually had 2 years in the 3s. And remember, both Bush and Trump had big tax cuts on the rich, though that helps the economy. Borrowing went up in their terms. Obama did not. He had more of a tax increase on the rich. Borrowing went down. We can take it back even further. 2000 is really Clinton. And look at the Clinton years. Oh, up in the 4s. I mean, these are massive, massive growth. We also know that during the Clinton years, we have the beginning of the internet. And that's a big part of it. We should be real about it here. We're keeping it 100. And then we're going to come down here. And we're going to say during Bush the First, that's our next negative, all the way from the Great Recession down to Bush the First. So it's negative. And then here are the Reagan years. Look at that. Boom. 7.2. Reagan. Boom. Years. But remember, Reagan put massive tax cuts. He started this massive borrowing thing. But that's huge. We haven't seen anything like that since. There's another negative during Reagan's terms, another negative during Reagan's, probably connecting back to Carter. Carter, though, boom, look at those years. What the heck? Followed by some really bad years here. These are Ford years. Nixon, okay, we're getting in the weeds. You start getting down here. This is when I said before that, like, after World War II, the U.S. was the only store open in town. So, of course, right, you're going to see massive GDP boost. This is GDP per capita growth, just to kind of show, okay, well, if you want to look at some of these comparisons, these are 5 years. These are, well, pretty big years here, GDP per capita versus GDP. Maybe we had growing population, I don't know. Anyways, interesting, right? Let's keep looking at some new fun stuff, right? This is GDP list. We're the richest country in the world, $22 trillion GDP. These are estimates. China at 16. You see China here actually in 2019, it was 14 trillion. China's economy is growing faster than ours. And the large part is because they have a billion people who don't have all of the modern stuff that we do today, or maybe that number is now 800 million, but as they're all getting TVs and spending money, cars, right, phones, internet, they're all spending a lot. And we're seeing China is just growing faster than anyone else in the world. But if you look down at the rest of the countries, Japan, Germany, India, growing really fast, actually. UK, France, a lot of European countries. Okay, this is GDP. Okay, we can go down and see, well, who are some of the poorer countries? There's, there's China. Well, China's up here actually in GDP. These are bigger countries, right? In order to have a high GDP, you need to have a lot of people. In the next list, we're going to look at average GDP per capita. We're going to find that China and India are much lower, the two most populous countries in the world, because you have to divide this number by their population. But as we come down, we'll just kind of look at the tail end of this list. We can slowly, maybe there's a country of interest that you want to take a look at. These are smaller population countries, right? These are teeny countries, and okay, I'm going to go a little quicker. Okay, what are we talking about? Right. What? Never even heard of it. None of these Marshall Islands. I've heard of the Marshall Islands. They're just, no one lives there. I shouldn't say that. There are very few people live there. Okay. GDP per capita. Now, this is the average GDP per person. This is your average salary. Where's USA? What? Right? Luxembourg? You ever heard of that place? No, because no one lives there. But guess what? There are a lot of banks there. It's a European country. 124,000 bucks a year. Bang. I thought we were rich. Singapore, we talked about this, trade capital, Southeast Asian country. Qatar, oil producing. Ireland, really? Ireland? I had no idea. Good for you. Bermuda, small islands, a lot of banks. Cayman Islands, we talked about this maybe today? No, it's a different class. Another place is where people stash their money. It's like a tax haven. I've been there actually. It's like an island, but it looks like Manhattan kind of. It's all built up. It's kind of this weird, crazy place. Very, very cool though. In the Caribbean, right next to Jamaica. There's actually this, I'm wasting time. There's a pirate ship that's like crashed into the harbor. You can see it. It's cool. Okay. Switzerland, that's where people stash their money. UAE, oil, Norway, Northern European. There we are though, number 8. Hey, pretty good, right? We're a rich country, you guys. We should recognize. Right, we're predicted to move up. Who are we going to pass? Okay, I'm wasting time. Because what I want to do now is try and see, where's China? As we look at the GDP per capita, the average salary of people, hey, Italy, way to go, guys. Look at that, EU together isn't even that high. If you take all the European Union, that's an interesting fact. Puerto Rico, that's America. It's part of our country, those are American citizens. We should know that. Mexico, okay, there's our neighbor to the south, great friend. We love Mexico. China, bang, I thought you were number 2 in the world. China, what happened, dude? All the way down there at 77. Where's India? They were like number 6. Well, India's doing pretty good, are they? We went, oh my gosh, 125, right. So GDP, real GDP, and GDP per capita. Different ways of measuring a country as well. Whether it be the whole country, the country adjusted for inflation, or the average people's salary.